home up on the hill in Jamestown, where Lucille Ball got her start. And neither of us were famous at that time. About a dozen years later, I had been spending a few years of my life living on a farm over in the town of Mina. And when I was 12 years old, I built a boat, not unlike some of the ones you're going to see here. It was 2 logs with some boards nailed on it, like a raft. And since that time, I've been involved with sailing and with boats and with ships. It's been quite a chapter of my life. But I still am fond of ships, and particularly the old square riggers. And you'll see some of those here. Inflated animal skins. And down on the right is a curragh made of leather, wood ribs and leather. And those are still used some places in the world. The carved out canoe, I saw the Carib Indians in Dominica carving a boat like that a few years ago. And they used carved out logs, so to speak, right up until in the 17 and 1800s. The history books show us that the Vikings came to this continent in the year 986, and they traveled widely. They traveled all over Russia, they traveled all of Europe, and they came to this continent very early in the game. And at the time when they came here, they reported that they found a race of small men with round faces who had no iron tools but used walrus tusks for knives. Sounds to me like Inuit. They were in Baffin Island, and we think that the Vikings came as far south, at least as Cape Cod, because they called that Vineland because there were wild grapes there. And then at one point, somebody from there went inland as far as Minnesota. And they actually set up a settlement. I believe it was Newfoundland. They did a dig on that just recently and found a very ancient settlement. And we believe that they came over, and one ship brought 25 sailors and brought their wives and settled in that era. The kind of ship that that was used on the Sea of Galilee 2,000 years ago. In fact, this picture was taken off from a piece of crockery that dates to that time. Dr. Peter Throckmorton, who was the greatest marine archaeologist the world has ever known, lived in Florida. He died just a few years ago. He did a lot of research over there, and that was the kind of ships they were using at that time to travel the Mediterranean and the Sea of Galilee. Not that actual one, because that's taken from a jug or a jar that had that printed on it. And that's quite enticing to me. If you want to find out a little bit more about ships of that era, you can get out this book and turn it to the 26th chapter of Acts and the 27th and 28th, and it tells about a man that was under arrest, was being shipped to Rome for trial. His name was Paul of Tarsus. And he describes that shipwreck very, very vividly. They actually had 70 and a little more people on it, and they ran into a storm, and the crew members were all for taking to the boats and escaping. Paul talked them into staying on the boat, and they actually put down drag anchors. This is an anchor of that period, and Throckmorton in his studies found a row of anchors coming up to that island, and they think that they slowed the ship with drag anchors enough so that when it grounded it didn't smash up, which it would have done if it had hit the rocks. But get your book of Acts, chapter 26, 27, and 28, and see if I'm telling you the truth.
Jack, let me just, we recently were in Israel, and go to the Sea of Galilee. There is a significant museum, and within that museum houses a boat which they uncovered probably about 15 years ago of that vintage.
Wow.
And it's really quite remarkable. They have a huge display of it, and not only the archaeology behind it, but also you could see the they actually dried it out and it's on display. But it's right on the Sea of Galilee.
These were on the Sea of Galilee.
Mm-hmm. So that's where they found it, and then in the mud bed, and they dug it up, and it was kind of an incredible thing to watch how they actually
it's
preserve
amazing how advanced some of the builders were at that time. They really had some real knowledge of how to build. Take a ship like that, it's not a whole lot different than the British Sea Lion. It's a little different shape, but you know, this one is 1586. Ernie Cowan built this ship as an exact replica of not a given ship, but he went to England and he got a treatise from the libraries there of shipbuilding that was published by Matthew Baker, who was first Queen Elizabeth's shipwright. And he made that ship this perfect copy of that treatise as he could do it, even using the hand tools and the square and compass as his main tools.
Again, for a guy that knows nothing about this, it's scary. But the Sea Lion, just one quick vignette. My dad decided one day that he would rent the Sea Lion. And so we got, with all the crew on board and everybody else, we went, and the whole family did a family reunion with on the Sea Lion, and did a trip. I took lots of movies of that, of the trip of the Sea Lion, and it was one of those wonderful days. The wind was blowing, and we really had quite a ride. I get a sense that they probably didn't have a lot of opportunities to do that just for the public to go on the Sea Lion.
Do you remember what year that was, Greg? It was commissioned in 1985, August 1985. And I joined the crew as a volunteer at that time and sailed it the first day it sailed and the last day it sailed, and as many times as I could during those 7 years. I had different positions on it, but oftentimes I was at the helm. And the helm wasn't a wheel.
No.
The ship didn't have a wheel. It had a whip staff, which is about the equivalent of a baseball bat stuck in the deck.
Yep.
And a rope on the bottom of it that went to pulleys and did the rudder. All you did was shove it back and forth to steer it.
I will bring it next time we get together.
I'd love to
the
see
movie,
it.
just to show it, because I don't know why I didn't think about it tonight.
I'm not sure I was on that day as crew, but I sailed more than most anybody else as a volunteer crew member on it for all those years. But that was quite a ship, and I will get into some more of that.
Yep.
That was sailed by a man named Cristobal Colombo, and he sailed it across the ocean. And look again, the shape of the hull and the high poop deck, not unlike the British ships. That was 1492. This was 1586. We're 100 years apart. But there's an awful lot of similarity there between those two ships. Different countries, 100 years apart. Triers. I don't know what triers means in Greek, but it is intended to mean 3 rows of oarsmen on each side. There were 3 tiers of oarsmen on each side of the ship to give it more power. Of course, it had some sails too, but it was actually made to be rowed when they wanted to really move out. The Greeks were great shipbuilders at one time. Model from the study they did of the port in Carthage. That was a round ship parking place, shelter, and it actually held 200 ships.
Oh my gosh.
And they had a chain across the mouth of the harbor so that nobody could come in without their permission. But that was the one in front that you see there is very, very similar to the Greek trier. But it was the port of Carthage in the early days, which was the 1500s ship. King Henry VIII's pride and joy. And the enemy was coming up the coast to do him a little battle one day, and Henry reviewed his navy from the land. It was a calm day and not much wind, and he was on shore reviewing his ships. And the Mary Rose was his best and one and only ship, he thought. They were coming up the coast. They had 700 men on it, complete with all their armor, armory, guns, everything they had. And they came on deck, actually had boarding nets on the deck so that the enemy couldn't get on. But they came up on deck, and with 700 men and all their armament, the center of gravity changed. The ship rolled, and they had forgotten to close the gun ports.
Huh.
The ship sunk right in front of King Henry, and only a handful, I guess a couple dozen men escaped. But he had 700 on there, and they most all went down. And it ruined the man. He just was never the same again. He lost interest in everything, I guess, at that time. I have a snipe class on Chautauqua Lake before that. I learned a lot about objects in motion and objects at rest. But we learned that real quickly with this one. The very first morning, we got out on the lake and hit a sandbar, and it stopped. And we got it off by the crew rocking the boat. We'd all walk to one side and then the other. And then they put a small boat on and towed us off the sandbar, and no harm done. But, that's what I said about, you learn about objects in motion and objects at rest. It takes a bit to start them again. But that was a 1586 model, and it was a wonderful ship to sail. We started our sailing training in April of that year, so by the time the ship was ready to go, we were ready to sail. But it took us a while to put those methods in action to get good at it, because a lot of people said that with that square rigger and the narrow lake we were on, you could never come about. But it didn't take us long to learn to come about. And we could go east and west, turn around and go right back. The ship was built right. It just took us a little while to learn the basics and how to do it.
How much into the wind could it point?
Pardon?
How many degrees into the wind could it point?
How many?
How many degrees into the wind could it point?
remember the exact number, but it was about a quarter off. About a quarter off, and we could sail.
How big was the crew on that, Jack?
Pardon?
How big was the sailing crew?
13.
13.
13. We had a lot of volunteers, and they usually took turns, or many of the same ones sailed all the time, but they changed off some. Both men and women, and most of them learned a position and did it a lot. I personally had sailed every position on there one time or another, but my main job was helm. I have to tell you a little story about the day of the commissioning of the ship. We had a man that was head of the National Maritime Historic Association, and he brought with him a man named Sir Adrian Cadbury, who was sent by the Queen of England as her representative because she couldn't come that day. So Sir Adrian and his friend were on the ship. We actually had the commissioning ceremony, and then we took them for a ride. And I was at the helm. Sir Adrian was right at my elbow. He was asking questions and was very, very interested in the actual physical operation of the boat. I did something that a common seaman could get convicted for. I said to Sir Adrian, "Would you like to take the helm?" And I stepped back, and he took the helm, and he was like a kid with a new toy. I mean, it really made his day. But I'll never forget, he was smiling and laughing and really, really enjoying himself. I can imagine when he gets home to tell the family what he'd been doing.
Right.
Cynthia, did you take a picture? I don't have any pictures.
Becky should have saved some film. That is a nice picture right there. You look right there, I was going to move the boat out, too.
No, but it's just, I wasn't just keeping an eye on one hook that just push yourself away. You just don't ride the boat.
I know it was that bad. I was scared.
It seemed like it was like that.
Well, I bet I didn't know it.
See that one woman come on, she was scared. No, I did.
Get first, then hello.
I think we're going to have a great vacation, great in-law reunion. Starting off with this. We're now rocking. See that? Feeling good, Greg? You got your sailor's legs?
That's why you're a Navy man. That's why you're leading
That's
this ship.
right. I mean, this is a piece of cake.
Jim Howard,
So he was Merchant Marine. Yeah.
Merchant Marine.
Come back on.
Good Charlie.
Brig got stern dolphin line, George.
Aye.
Well, it puts it back out. There's more than 8.
Go around below.
We'll haul it in until we get away from it. We're away now.
Okay.
My name is Captain Hughes. Very pleased to have all of you aboard. And hope you enjoy your experience. This is the first time we've departed in this manner from the mooring. If we have problems, I have to apologize for that, so that's what we can do.
Here's to our fearless captain. Okay, Gladys, lead a prayer for the captain.
Yeah.
You got it.
Oh, it's been just a little bit. There's nothing first to do. And we've been sitting on the land.
Think about lying off.
Nice breeze.
Set the main zone.
how it's gonna blow.
First at the main topsail. Ready on the forecastle for the forecourse?
All right.
Set the forecourse.
Oh, let yours run.
Hold it. Bowlins.
Did we lose by Bowens?
Okay. Okay, George.
Lot of wind, lot of wind.
There should be enough wind on this boat today.
Keep a little starboard helm on.
Shoot the cannon that way.
Just,
Ready on the main topsail? Set the main topsail. Where's the movie projector?
Boats are, everything are doing well this year.
Oh, good technical.
you are going to be immortalized.
Right.
It's a match. This is what we'll light it with. Prepare the fire! I know. Fire! All the fore yards, port! They'll buy the wind.
Yeah, I could have
You know, and keep that course as long as the flag is brought to the beach. You have to bring it back, bring it to starboard. Falling off to the port. You don't have to bring it back.
All right, John.
On the forecastle. When you've completed your duties, set your bowlines taut. On the beakhead. Set your bowlines taut when you get other lines secured. Not the girl in the small boat.
We sailed it 7 summers, and then some of our county government got involved and said it wasn't making any money, we were going to sell it. They sold it for $1 to a man from Buffalo. The cannons alone, there were 10 cannons, they cost $1,600 a piece. The sails were thousands. We had a tender boat with it that went, all the tools, everything, and they sold it for $1. And those of us that were crew members and part of that thing, we were really dismayed. In fact, I was so dismayed I couldn't give it up. I went to Erie and volunteered to be a crew member on the Brig Niagara. which was a modern boat compared to this 1586 one. That was built in 1813, but it was much bigger. This one was about 69 feet long, but the Brig Niagara was a total of 185 overall and 118 feet tall, and it was a 400-tonner. And we'll get to that again, but I volunteered for that and took sail training down there. And for 7 summers, I volunteered to sail on the Brig Niagara. So it's kind of in my blood. I like the square riggers, and I'm not interested much in modern boats. I've got one over there of a type, a sailing boat that won a world class in 18 something. But I'm still very fond of the old square riggers. They were very practical, and it took a lot of work to sail them because everything was done by muscle. There wasn't much mechanism to them. You had pulleys and ropes, but there wasn't much.
Jack, before you get off the subject, conclude the story on the Sea Lion. As we know, it's in Westfield. What happened? What were the steps that got it at least back into Chautauqua County?
Okay, the pirate that stole it, he set it up in Buffalo and tried to make a living taking passengers out of Buffalo Harbor, and he did pretty fair for a while, but he lost interest in it, and then it sunk in Buffalo Harbor, and he left it there. Didn't even bother to raise it. Mm-hmm. And it spent 2 winters under the ice, with the ice beating up the stern. It was sticking out of the water. And for 2 winters and 2 summers, we went to him and tried to make a deal with him to bring it back. We had a committee. I was chairman of the committee, and Paul Webb and John Cheney and I were on the committee to bring back the Sea Lion. We finally made a deal with that guy, and we bought it back for $1. But we didn't get everything. He kept the logbook, which he had promised to give us. Many of the cannons had been gone elsewhere, and the sails, when in Mayville at Chautauqua Lake, if it rained on those sails, some crew member was designated to go up there the next morning, unfurl the sails, and let them dry out in the sun, and then furl them up again. And they lasted all the time we had it in great shape. They never bothered. If the sails got wet, so be it. So when they got through with it, the sails were pretty rotten. The rigging wasn't much good, and the ice had bashed some of the top boards on it. But anyway, we got our dive team. Art knows about that. Got our art team, the dive team from the county, and they froze their butts for almost a year, every weekend in Buffalo, trying to raise that boat, because you stop and think about it, it had 21 tons of ballast in it, mostly iron, some railroad irons and some rods, a few stones, but there were 21 tons of iron in it, and it was stuck in the mud. There was no way to raise it, so they went down there, took a barrel on a pulley, and put those rods all in the barrel, a few at a time, and took them out, took them out, took them out. They got all of that stuff out, and then they still couldn't raise it. So then they got some inflatable bladders and put in the water down in the hull and inflated them. That loosened it a little bit, but it still wasn't enough. And then they finally got a crane to lift on it too, and they raised it and got it up, and then towed it back to Barcelona. And we had a big decision to make. It wasn't in any shape to sail, what to do with it. So we got permission to put it at Barcelona Harbor on the land, and we have restored it. We replaced all the wood that was broken. We have oiled and we replaced all the caulking that needed it, and oiled the decks, and we've repainted it. We have it in pretty good shape now, and we want to finish it up this summer. But we don't have the money to buy the rigging yet. So a lot of people say, will it sail again? Well, we'd love to see it sail again, but it's quite a ways from sailing. But we have tried our best to make it presentable as a historic museum for the next generation to see it. And I think we're doing a reasonable job of that. That was Ernie's goal. He made it for a sailing museum. And it worked for 7 years here and for some time in Buffalo, but we'd like to sail it again someday, but I can't promise you we will. But we have it pretty well restored, and we hope to put the masts up this summer. That was the Half Moon, which was a very good replica of Hendrik Hudson's Half Moon. But the interesting thing there was that the Dutch set up a trading post on Manhattan Island that year, which they kept forever, and they never gave it up, except that that was 1609, and I think it was 1686. A British warship came up to the battery and aimed their guns at them and said, "You guys surrender. We'll give you 3 days to make up your mind." They huddled, the Dutch merchants and the people huddled and talked about it. What can we do? We don't have an army, we don't have a navy, we don't have any guns, what can we do? So they went back to the admiral and said, "Look, we'll surrender if you'll let us stay here and keep our businesses." And he did, and they did. So they surrendered, but they stayed there and kept their trading posts and their businesses on Manhattan Island, which I think was a pretty good example of a clever surrender.
Yep.
That was the Dutch, 1609. But Ernie built this thing not along the lines of the Sea Lion, because he had a model to copy for the Half Moon, which was a Dutch vessel. That is a model of the Mayflower, 1620. Now, I've told you that the Vikings were here long before that and settled. The Dutch were here in 1609. Virginia colony was also here in 1607, and I'll show you their ships in a minute. But the bottom line is that 1620 was not the first settlement here. It was the first British settlement to keep on going and last through the centuries, but there are several other instances. I have to bring my genealogy in here. The Mormon Family History Library says that Samuel Dean was born in Taunton, Massachusetts in 1610. And his wife was born there in 1614. And I haven't got it figured out yet what his mother was doing there at that time, but she was here and had a baby in 1610. And I'm a direct descendant of Samuel Dean. But the history books tell us 1620 was the beginning, so we kind of have to go with that. Like the 1492 discovery of America. That guy never discovered America. He got rich off the gold and silver mines that the Spaniards set up. In fact, after he had done the Caribbean islands and went back home, he took some Caribbean Indians with him to show to the king and queen as slave material. Wonderful source of slave material. And then after that, he set up a deal to divide the New World, so-called, east and west, between Portugal and Spain. And he made a deal with each king to get a cut off all the stuff they got. And I say he made so much money, he hired a public relations department the best money could get and kept that figment going for 500 years that he had discovered America. But I think we ought to change those monuments, take those plaques off there, and say he originated Caribbean cruises and he started slavery.
Actually, 1619 was when the first slaves were brought in.
Pardon?
Before, yeah. Before the Mayflower.
Yes, yes. 1609 was well before the Mayflower,
19.
and 1610 was before the Mayflower. Okay, these are some additional pictures of the Mayflower in Plymouth Harbor. Of Jamestown Island, the Sarah Constant, the Goodspeed, and the Discovery came in May of 1607. I have walked on the decks on those. These are replicas, of course. I have walked on the decks of those ships too. They're not unlike the Sea Lion and the Mary Rose and many other ships. 1679, that ship was built down in Buffalo. I think it's Cayuga Creek, right on the shore there in 1679 by who was it? LaSalle and his trusty priest, Father Hennepin, built that ship, and they sailed it. They were explorers. They sailed it on the Great Lakes. The ship disappeared, and we don't know where it went. Obviously, it sunk someplace, and they've never found the remains. They never found the wreck. Sailed for a short time here, and one guy said he thought that probably frightened many an Indian with that.
Yeah, they had cannons on it.
Pardon?
They had cannon.
Yeah, it had cannons.
Yeah.
And it had a figurehead of a griffin, hence the name. To the War of 1812, our country had no navy. They didn't have a ship. But they hired privateers, and they armed a lot of merchant ships. And these were pretty good at it. This was a Yankee privateer that captured a huge Spanish galleon loaded with 100,000 pounds of sterling. That was privateering. It was legitimate because the government authorized them to defend us from the British ships. And the sentence was usually hanging for desertion of the Royal Navy. Some of these privateers began to branch out and go trading far away. There was a Captain Dean who lived in Albany. He was not a relative, I'm pretty sure, but he was a privateer in the war, and according to the history, he applied for a pension and it was denied because they were not military, so he didn't get a pension. After the war, he went back to Albany and he got bored, so he joined up with a man in New York that wanted to try something new. Captain Dean fitted out this ship for him, and he took it from New York to Canton, China. And he was the second ship from here to make that trip. 11,000 miles each way, and he returned with every member of his crew intact and had a wonderful trading sail. They took a load of goods over, and they came back with silks and dishes and all the stuff the Chinese wanted to trade. They had a whole load of that and made a ton of money for their owner. But this is it took a year and a half, and it was 22,000 miles round trip. But that kind of opened up the Chinese trade.
What year was that?
Pardon?
What year? The year? Ballpark.
1820, and they took refuge in the Canada Creek. And the widow Cole lived there, and she got on a horse and went uptown to get some help. They came back with soldiers, and they literally drove the British away. But that was theoretically at least the first shots of the War of 1812. Was the British were trying to steal the salts from that ship. Sovereign of the seas. And look at the decks. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 decks, and that rigging just makes me dizzy. Just try to figure out the rigging. Niagara, 400 tons, 185 feet overall, 118 feet to the top of the mainmast. Crew of 39. And I sailed on that for 7 summers too. And that's the one that we took to New York for the Tall Ships Parade. We were berthed right next to the Norwegian training ship there. Actually, we were in the East River at the South Street Seaport Harbor, and there were some wonderful ships around us. But we sailed it more than that. Once we took it on Lake Erie out to the Put-in Bay site where the battle occurred. They've got a monument out there that's 100 feet tall, and they really, really revere the fact that Perry won that battle. And if you do any studying of that at all, he was on another ship, and it was out of commission. The sails were shot through, and the yards were wrecked. Couldn't do anything. The Niagara had laid back and didn't get into that fray. It was a light wind that day, so he could have had the excuse he couldn't get there any quicker, but the commander of the Niagara was laying back. Perry got in a rowboat and took half a dozen of his best men and went over there and says, "I'm taking over." He took command of the Niagara, and he went back, and the British had their ships all lined up, and they had more ships than we did, and he broke the line, which means he sailed right between the Detroit and the Queen Charlotte, shooting double-balled cannons both ways, and they couldn't shoot at him or they'd hit their own ships. So in a very short time, he ran up the white flag, and his answer to his commander after that, the report of the battle was, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." And he named the Detroit, named all the ships that he had taken. I think it was 8 of them that he had captured, and ended the Battle of Lake Erie, and really put the British Navy out of business. Sewing the sails out on the bowsprit. The ship was new and it wasn't quite completed, and we were sewing this on the sails, and the bottom one were at the helm. It's just a big pole about 20 feet long, inboard, fastened to the rudder, but one man can't even handle it, it's so heavy. But you have to have a safety on it, because if a wave hit that rudder with a 20-foot lever, it would knock those 2 guys overboard. So what they do is run a line each way on a pulley, and each man stands there with his hand on the line, so that if something comes up quick, you can take hold of that and stop that thing from swinging. But that's, I spent quite a lot of time at the helm on that one also. That's the Cutty Sark and another ship, and they were always racing when they made these trips. They got their kicks out of trying to be the first one to beat the other guy. Cutty Sark is short chemise, skirt, dress. And the story is Tam O'Shanter was a farmer, was coming home one night on his horse after stopping it for a pint or two or maybe three, and he went by the cemetery and there were 3 ghosts there. 2 of them were old and ugly, but one of them was kind of young and pretty. But that one came after him and tried to catch him, and he escaped, barely escaped, by crossing the River Dune on a bridge. And everybody knows that witches can't cross water. But she did grab the horse's tail and got a handful of hair. So when they named this ship the Cutty Sark, they didn't have the hair in the beakhead, but the sailors always put a piece of rope there to kind of take the place of the hair that witch caught. But this is the picture of the beakhead. It was wooden carved beakhead on the Cutty Sark, and that was the ship you saw in that last picture. I think I got another picture of it in a race too. Anybody been to Connecticut, to Mystic, Connecticut?
Mm-hmm.
That is the Morgan, the last of the whalers. And those people took that ship and restored it. And I have read a couple of places that Mystic, Connecticut is one of the top tourist attractions on the East Coast because of the program they've got there in that old ship. And I can't understand why I can't get more support for the Sea Lion, because we're a lot older than the Morgan in style and actuality. But I think we could make Barcelona Harbor and Westfield into another Mystic, Connecticut, if we get the right program going to promote it. 5 sails high, but look on the left and the right. You got another set of sails on each side. And those were called the Stunsails. I don't know where that term came from, but S-T-U-N. Stunsails, to give it more power, more canvas to the wind. They put all the sails they could carry on there to get more speed. The oldest ship of the U.S. Navy. Any of you ever seen that one?
No.
What do you want to tell us about it?
Let's see, that would be the
Constellation.
Constellation, yeah.
Yeah, that's in Baltimore Harbor. It was commissioned by George Washington, built after his time, but that is the oldest ship in the U.S. Navy, the Constellation. And, but they could not penetrate the sides of that ship with their cannons. That's what the harbor looked like. Deserted ships. They literally sat there. In fact, sometimes people made their money in the gold rush, and they bought one of those ships for a token, tied it to a dock, and started a store or a manufacturing or something in it, rather than build a house. But many of those ships never left San Francisco. They rotted down in the harbor there. From her developed the Grand Bank schooners. She had quite a few improvements. I don't know what all of them were, but they, in 1790, got the bright idea of putting a steam engine on board and he was going to run it with oars at first, but then somebody came up with the idea of a paddle wheel, and he made it work. But that was the beginning of an era. Steamship to sail across an ocean. But you'll notice that they kept the sails even after they developed the steam engine.
Why was it called a coffin?
Well, I guess they thought it wasn't safe. That steam engine there, it might explode, you might have a fire. It was dangerous. The paddle wheel, it was a propeller-driven boat. Enough wood and coal to cross the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean. So they used sails part of the time and used the steam to supplement. Thinks that sailors are kind of an uneducated lot, that they are people that dropped out of school, went to sea. Some of them did at 12 and 13 years old. And in fact, 12 and 13-year-old boys had a place in ships then. They called them powder monkeys. And they carried the powder from the armament to the cannons. And they had 12 and 13-year-old boys doing that because they were quick and fast and didn't take up much space. And so they started at those ages. But what I'm driving at is that I think the public thinks that a lot of sailors are illiterate. But if you tell me how one person could know all of those terms and know how to handle them and work them without a pretty good education. But I think that they are quite knowledgeable, or else they better have a first or second mate that knows what he's doing. But I had a powerboat once. I had a Chris Craft, a 1955 wooden Chris Craft with a Chrysler engine in it. That was a lot of fun. That isn't sailing, but it's the water. I've always been intrigued with the water. And I guess this, maybe in the family a little bit, I've got a son, my eldest son, he liked the water with me. He moved to Florida and joined the Broward County Marine Archaeological Society, and they actually went to see. They built a raft and had a pumping machine on it to pump the sand instead of try to shovel it like a fire hose to uncover. And they did a great study of the wrecks in Florida, and he's written a book about the wrecks in Florida. He was president of the Broward County Marine Archaeological Society, and then he went sailing for a couple of years after that in his youth.
When they were furling and unfurling the sails up to the high level, how are they supported, and do they have safety lines on, or how does that work?
There's a line under.
That would only come from a lawyer, by the way, who would answer those questions. Safety
line
lines.
under the pole you stand on, and there's a line on top of the pole, and you're supposed to hook your belt to it. You have a belt with a short piece with a hook on it, and you're supposed to put that on the line, although it kind of gets in your way if you're moving very much, but there are safety measures. I've never known anybody to fall off them. One more thing on this, visitors on the ship. On the Brig Niagara, when we went to put in bay for the celebration out there of the anniversary of that battle, there was a young Navy officer that came on board. We had the people, the governor sent people, and the mayor sent people, and the state of Ohio. There were a lot of famous people on there, but this one young Navy officer in his uniform was there, and everybody was kind of neglecting him, I thought. and they called for crew to go aloft, and that was included me. I took off my belt and handed it to him. He went aloft with the crew, and he had a day like Sir Adrian did. Thank you much.
Well, to Jack, you know, isn't it fun to just watch somebody with a high degree of passion about something, and Jack, you've exhibited it today, so we can't thank you enough for sharing this wonderful hobby of yours and passion, and